Welcome to History at Age 9, a program about naval history from the Hampton Roads Naval Museum in Norfolk, Virginia, home of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. On the first day out at sea, Admiral Evans revealed to the officers and men of the fleet Roosevelt's plan for the voyage, which had previously not been shared with anyone except for a few of the highest-ranking naval officials. As far as everyone knew, they were just going on training exercises from the east to the west coast, a practice cruise to the Pacific. Evans laid out the plan. Following a brief stay on the west coast, the fleet would return home via the Pacific through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean and then to the Atlantic. In short, they would be steaming around the globe. The next day, when the announcement became common knowledge, countries throughout the world offered invitations for the fleet to visit their ports. The voyage of the Great White Fleet would take 14 months, and the sailors would travel 45,000 miles and make 20 port calls on 6 different continents. In short, they would be steaming around the globe. I'm Catherine Renfrew, and this is Voyage of a Lifetime, The Great White Fleet, 1907 to 1909, Episode 2, To the Pacific. On December 23rd, the fleet arrived at their first port, the Port of Spain in Trinidad, a small island off the coast of Venezuela. This first stop left a lot to be desired. Unfortunately, the arrival of the fleet coincided with the opening of the horse racing season, and they received a tepid, if not indifferent, reception. The sailors were not very happy. According to one of the sailors, when they arrived, there were no people around, and almost everything was closed up. Just one building was open that had any beer in it. By the time we made it to shore, the stuff was hot as hell. It was just like drinking boiler water. Another commented that there wasn't much to do except look at the flowers and visit a leper colony. The cruise celebrated Christmas with swimming and other activities. The officers of USS Minnesota gave a Christmas celebration aboard their ship to the other officers. Men of the Vermont sailed around singing songs to every ship. They steamed on toward Rio de Janeiro for their next port of call. Just 3 days after the fleet left Hampton Roads, every ship received a wireless message from King Neptune. The message was a warning to be ready to receive the ruler of the deep on crossing the equator. The traditional crossing the line ceremonies were going to be unpleasant for the sailors who had not crossed before, but even more so for those who did not show up. On January 3, 1908, the fleet began crossing the equator. More than 12,000 sailors underwent initiation. They were shaved with an oversized razor, took a long descent into a pool of water, they had a ritual bath, and I'm sure unwillingly participated in other activities. They were pollywogs no more, but shellbacks inducted into the Order of the Deep. The fleet arrived in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, on January 12, 1908. They received their first mail call, which was the highlight of every sailor's day. One sailor remembered that there was one man aboard the USS Connecticut who couldn't read. He said whenever this fellow got mail, he'd have someone read his letters to him, and he'd make whoever was doing it stick cotton in his ears so he wouldn't be able to hear what he was reading. He thought he could keep his privacy that way. Unlike Trinidad, the sailors' visit to Rio was anything but boring. The visit included official luncheons and parties for the officers and general liberty for the crews. Regrettably, the sailors became engaged in a fight at one of the more spirited bars on their first night in town. It was a disaster, to say the least. 2 local longshoremen were arguing and threw a beer bottle at the other, but missed and hit a sailor from the Louisiana. Of course, you can imagine what happened next. Sailors came to the aid of their comrades, and the longshoremen did the same. All heck broke out. When the shore patrol and police finally arrived, the fight had flowed into the street, where they witnessed the 2 groups throwing bricks and rocks at each other. Order was restored, and the sailors were escorted back to their ships. The confrontation came close to breaking the goodwill ties between the U.S. Navy and Brazil. The following day, an investigation determined that it was the civilians' fault. Therefore, the Brazilian officials forgave the sailors. To improve relations, officials publicly invited all the sailors to continue to enjoy their hospitality. There were no further incidents, and everyone had a great time. Now, while in Rio, Admiral Evans had an attack of gout, which he continued to suffer with throughout the cruise. Eventually, this illness would be to blame for him being relieved of command. The fleet left Rio and headed toward the Strait of Magellan, near the southern tip of South America toward the Pacific. The strait is a natural mountain-rimmed and very narrow passage in southern Chile that separates the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Unpredictable winds and currents make it difficult to traverse. The fleet had no choice but to take that course since the Panama Canal had not been completed at that time. In a line 3 miles long, the battleships thread their way through the perilous Strait of Magellan. Newspaper headlines back home in the United States printed sensational stories predicting shipwrecks and said our boys are in terrible danger. They all knew that the straits were all inhabited by cannibals. It was windy and foggy, but a Chilean cruiser came to their aid and guided the fleet through the straits without any issues whatsoever. The fleet made a brief stop in Punta Arenas, Chile. Arriving in the South Pacific, they followed a naval parade through the harbor of Valparaiso, Chile, and steamed on towards Peru. The fleet reached Callao, located just north of Lima, the capital, on February the 20th. The Peruvians welcomed the American sailors with open arms, and the American sailors eagerly accepted their hospitality. 9 days of celebrations that included commemorations of George Washington's birthday. Peruvian composer Cesar Panizo composed a special dance piece entitled The White Squadron. A small tugboat rode around the anchored ships, its passengers performing Cornell football cheers and songs for the cruise, and the sailors were entertained by bullfights in Lima. The next stop was a month-long stay in Magdalena Bay, Mexico, where arrangements had been made with the Mexican government that allowed the Americans to hold gunnery exercises, drills, and sports. Now, while the fleet was in Mexico, California's coastal cities were trying everything in their power to get the fleet to visit their ports. They succeeded. The fleet visited many ports along the coast of California, including San Diego, Los Angeles, Santa Cruz, Santa Barbara, Monterey, and San Francisco. When the fleet pulled into San Diego on April 14, 1908, the sailors were greeted by thousands of enthusiastic residents as the great ships anchored off the Hotel del Coronado. Small boats of all descriptions surrounded the warships, and sailors were pelted with blossoms by flower committees and filled to capacity with free lemonade by fruit committees. For the next 4 days, San Diego celebrated, and the sailors were given the royal treatment that ended only with the fleet's departure for Los Angeles on April 18th. It is said by historians that if the fleet had not stopped to visit San Diego at that time, San Diego might not have become the Navy town that it is today. Like San Diego, when the fleet arrived in San Francisco on May 6th, the hills surrounding the city by the bay were packed with thousands of greeters, many brought in by special trains from outlying communities. While the men were enjoying the hospitality of San Franciscans, some elements of the fleet traveled north to Washington under the command of Rear Admiral C.M. Thomas. Stops included Seattle, Bellingham, and Tacoma. The citizens of Seattle gave each ship a baby bear. It was common at that time for local officials to give animals to visiting ships. There were cats and dogs on all the ships, but more unusual and exotic animals were often adopted as mascots. The mighty battleships of the U.S. fleet received everything from kangaroos to eagles to bears. Some animals didn't work out so well. For example, monkeys given to sailors on one of the ships escaped their enclosures and made a home among the smokestacks, biting anyone who tried to catch them. One sailor said, We keep adding a little to our host of pets in most every port, and the Connecticut begins to look more like a menagerie than a warship. Our list now stands as follows: 6 dogs, all breeds about the same number of cats, a pig, parrots, and a monkey from Trinidad, a black bear from Seattle, a kangaroo, an eagle, 2 native opossums, and more parrots from Sydney. The electricians have a pair of white rats from Los Angeles, 2 Angora goats from Punta Arenas, and 1 from Santa Barbara, and a raccoon from Rio. The ships received needed repairs at Navy yards on the West Coast like Puget Sound. While in port at San Francisco, Evans' health continued to worsen, and command of the fleet passed to Rear Admiral Charles Sperry. Also, the squadrons were slightly rearranged, bringing the newest and best ships in the fleet up to the first squadron. Glacier was detached and later became the supply ship of the Pacific Fleet. At this time also, USS Maine and Alabama were replaced by USS Nebraska and USS Wisconsin due to their high coal consumption. The fleet's visit up and down the West Coast lasted almost 3 months. That part of the cruise appeared to be a continuous party with everyone, civilians and sailors, celebrating the fleet. On July 7th, the fleet regrouped, and Rear Admiral Sperry, Admiral Evans' replacement, took the fleet to sea again and continued its journey across the Pacific.